I want to welcome you here tonight to the White House East Room here at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. My name is Joe Lopez, and I have the honor of serving as the Vice President of Marketing and Communications for the Richard Nixon Foundation. And I want to start by recognizing someone very special here in the audience today, a member of the Board of Directors and the Treasurer of the Richard Nixon Foundation, Charlie Zhang. Charlie, thank you for being here and for your leadership with the Richard Nixon Foundation. So this evening we're here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's historic visit to Tehran. And you're about to watch a fascinating presentation. But before we start our program, I want to give special recognition to some dear friends, Susie and Jeff Elgonian, who were supposed to be with us tonight, but cannot be here due to unforeseen circumstances. So to recognize Susie, Jeff, and their family during this time, I want to share a piece by the poet Rumi. The piece is titled Zero Circle. Be helpless, dumbfounded, unable to say yes or no. Then a stretcher will come from grace to gather us up. We are too dull-eyed to see that beauty. If we say we can, we're lying. If we say no, we don't see it. That no will behead us and shut tight our window onto spirit. So let us rather not be sure of anything besides ourselves, and only that, so miraculous beings come running to help. Crazed, lying in a zero circle, mute, we shall be saying finally, with tremendous eloquence, lead us. When we have totally surrendered to that beauty, we shall be a mighty kindness. Thank you. And now to our program. Our moderator tonight at the Nixon Library is the President and CEO of the Richard Nixon Foundation and a historian in his own right, Jim Byron.
Thank you. So thank you, Joe, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And I especially want to welcome, as Joe said, Charlie Zhang, because we're in the beautiful White House East Room tonight, and this room looks the way that it does because of Charlie's generosity, along with his wonderful wife, Ling, the beautiful screens, the clean chandeliers, the brand new floor, everything. Charlie made it all happen. So thank you very much for what you do. We're here to commemorate the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's historic visit to Tehran and to renew ties with a special community in Los Angeles and in Orange County, that of the Iranian diaspora and Iranian Americans. And we've conceived of this evening as the first in a series to celebrate the Iranian people and President Nixon's special relationship with them. One prominent Iranian sent us a special greeting tonight, which I'd now like to read. Good evening. I regret that I am unable to be with you in Yorba Linda this evening to mark the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's historic visit to my country, Iran, in May of 1972. However, I wish to thank the Richard Nixon Foundation for organizing this event and to send my warm greetings to all of you gathered in the East Room. The long and personal friendship between my father, the late Shah, and President Nixon began with their first meeting in Tehran in 1953. It continued over 26 years until their final meeting in our exile in Cuernavaca, Mexico in 1979, when I was able to express my deep appreciation to the president in person. A year later, under most unfortunate circumstances, I was able to do so again when President Nixon joined me, President Sadat, and my mother, the Shabanu, in my father's funeral procession in Cairo. Neither my family nor the Iranian people will forget his loyalty to my father and his moral courage in standing beside us when so many others had turned their backs. Their relationship was based on mutual respect, and their friendship was based on mutual understanding and esteem. In 1969, my father said that Mr. Nixon had shown in all his life how well he understands the problems of our world and the problems of today and the problems of the future. More than all of this, President Nixon knew the history of Iran. He valued our richness of our culture and the majesty of our civilization. He appreciated my father's vision of an Iran egalitarian, modernizing and strong at home, and steadfast and partnered with allies in the region and across the oceans abroad. In May 1972, 50 years ago, Mr. Nixon said that he was especially privileged to be in Tehran during the celebration of our country's 2,500th year. He said, "I realize that as we compare our two countries, we owe so much to you, not only for 2,500 years, but for a history that goes back even 6,000 years. Congratulations to the Nixon Foundation on the launch of the Lion and Sun Society, and congratulations to the Institute for Voices of Liberty on the opening of the Virtual Museum of Remembrance." Evenings like tonight at the Nixon Library allow us to remember and honor the past and those who sacrificed for it. They also allow us to learn from the past and use those lessons to build a better future. On behalf of my compatriots, especially those suffering under the most unimaginable circumstances in Iran, I hope that initiatives like these help us reclaim our nation in its honor and rebuild it for generations that will come after us. I firmly believe that as glorious as our history is, our future can be even brighter. We owe it to the Iranian people to strive for that. I wish your projects the best of success, and thank you again for coming this evening. Signed, Reza Pahlavi. The visit, which the Prince referenced by President Nixon in May 1972, was significant in the context of the Cold War, the supreme signal of Iranian hegemony in the Persian Gulf, and the high water mark of a tilt toward Iran enacted by the Nixon administration, and the first time in 13 years that a US president had visited Iran. It was also significant to the foundational principles of the Pahlavi regime and an endorsement of His Imperial Majesty's campaign to modernize Iran in record time. We'll get into that this evening in the discussion, and to do that, I'd like to welcome our two special guests joining us via Zoom. It's a little odd because I'm the only one up here standing on the stage, but I'm very privileged to have our two guests joining us via Zoom, beginning with Colonel John V. Brennan, former Marine military aide to President Nixon, and his chief of staff in the post-presidency years in San Clemente. Few people alive today spent more time with President Nixon. And Jack, it's a real pleasure to have you with us. I'd also like to welcome from Brussels, where I don't know what time in the morning it is, but it's very early, Dr. Andrew Scott Cooper, an historian and commentator on U.S.-Iranian relations and global energy markets. He's the author of The Fall of Heaven, The Pahlavis and the Final Days of Imperial Iran, and also The Oil Kings, How the U.S., Iran, and Saudi Arabia Changed the Balance of Power in the Middle East. So we have a lot to cover tonight, and there's a lot to this 50th anniversary commemoration, so we're not going to be able to do it all this evening. But as I said, this is only the first program in a series of engagements, and we're going to welcome additional scholars in Iranian history, art, and culture as we mark the golden age of Iran over the next 3 or so years. Tonight I want to begin by talking about Iran and the U.S. in the Cold War, which of course was an uneasy alliance. The U.S. was locked in an epic struggle against the Soviet Union, and a vacuum was created in the Middle East as a result of British withdrawal from the region. Tensions were high in the immediate post-World War II period as the young Mohammad Reza Shah assumed the peacock throne from his father, and to put it lightly, he was young and inexperienced. So I want to begin tonight with Dr. Cooper. Talk to us about U.S. interests in the region during the post-war period, the late 40s, the early 1950s, and can you set up for us the relationship between the U.S. and Iran, which might have been viewed at the time as a client state?
Well, good evening. I'm very happy to be back at the Nixon Library after 5 years, even though this is by Zoom. And so I'm happy to see old friends in the audience as well. Yes, in terms of US-Iran relations, if we go back to the late 1940s, we remember that Iran was one of the original frontline states in the Cold War. During the Second World War, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States had occupied Iran to prevent the Germans from coming through. And at the end of the war, even though the Russians had promised to withdraw their troops, Stalin paused, and there was, of course, the crisis in northern Iran and Azerbaijan. And it was really the Truman administration that put pressure on Stalin, and the Russians did eventually withdraw their troops, but that created an American interest in Iran's future. And there was tremendous concern that Iran become a stronger country because otherwise, if the Soviets could drive south, they could get down to the Persian Gulf and, of course, get access to the oil. It's important to realize also that during World War II, Iran's security became intertwined with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, of course, had bigger oil deposits, and Iran was seen already by US planners, military planners during World War II as a bulwark, as a block against that Soviet penetration south. In the late 1940s, the US opened a military operation in Iran. They sent military advisors in to train the Iranian army. The investment increased after 1953 with the overthrow of the Mossadegh government. And in the late 1950s, the Shah approved the construction of listening bases on Iran's northern frontier with the Soviet Union. And these listening bases actually became very important for Nixon and Kissinger during the détente period, because those listening bases could monitor every Soviet missile test in Central Asia during the early 70s period. So whenever there was a debate over whether to allow the Shah to purchase more US weapons, the CIA director, Richard Helms, would usually come in and remind both men that those listening posts were critical to the US-Soviet relationship as well in terms of the negotiations with SALT, the SALT Treaty, the SALT Accords. The US investment in Iran increased in the 1960s, but it was relatively stable because there was what we call a fiscal firewall that prevented the Shah from ordering too many military programs, too many weapons. There was always, the Shah always had to take in, the US made sure that the Iranians did not order weapons that might place a strain on Iran's domestic economy. There was always a concern that it would drain resources away from healthcare, education, and they wanted Iran to stabilize during this period. But by the late 60s, by the time President Nixon came into power, Iran was seen as the model of modernization, not only in West Asia, but actually throughout the developing world. There was this balance of economic development, military strengthening happening. And as you said in the introduction, this was really a golden age for the Iranian people. I mean, this was a heyday of the Pahlavi dynasty as well, where you have this extraordinary alignment of a growing economy, a strengthening military. The region was relatively peaceful at that time, and Iran had emerged under the Shah, especially in this late 60s period after the coronation in 67, as a relatively a stable country, a prosperous country, and the middle class was starting to take root in Iran too. So for all these reasons, when Nixon came in, he was very interested in Iran. He had a personal relationship with the Shah going back to 1953. But the two men also saw the world in similar terms, in similar geopolitical terms. Nixon had visited Tehran in April 1967. This is a very interesting and important visit, by the way. And the two men held long hours of talks at Niavaran Palace, and they talked about the future of the Persian Gulf. Already by that time, it was clear that Great Britain was going to withdraw their navy from east of Suez. The British Royal Navy, of course, had been responsible for security guarantees in that region for about 100 years. So there was a fear that there would be a power vacuum once the British left. The United States was preoccupied on the other side of the Asian subcontinent in Vietnam, and there was no domestic American appetite for a military buildup on the western side of the continent. So the US and British governments, the Western governments, looked around for an ally who could replace the British in the Persian Gulf and West Asia as a stabilizing force. And
I got to jump in because we're
yes,
going to get to that. And I don't want you to get too far ahead. I want to bring you back to 1953 because that's the year
53,
that Vice President Nixon paid a visit to the Shah in Tehran. And Colonel Brennan, you spent a lot of time with both men. I mean, you spent hours on end with them. I'm sure that our audience this evening will love to hear some of those stories throughout the evening. Colonel Brennan, what were President Nixon, at that time Vice President Nixon's impressions of the Shah, his feelings toward him, and vice versa? What did you see through your up-close and personal interaction with both?
Oh, first, I'm intrigued by Dr. Cooper's dissertation, but I was not, when he was vice president, I was not with him. During his presidential and post-presidential years, he expressed on many, many occasions his incredible admiration and he really liked the Shah of Iran, trusted him, and was almost more a friendship than a diplomatic relationship. And so we had a lot of interconnection, a lot of interaction. Mine, to a large degree, was via the Shah's ambassador to the United States, Ardashir Zahidi. But I did, of course, go on the trip to Tehran with President Nixon in 1972. Was with him Cuernavaca, visited the Shah in his final days in New York at the hospital at the Sloan Kettering, I believe. So mine is more a listening on the side and observing and seeing the incredible relationship which led to amazing differences in the world.
Absolutely, and as you said, they had a very close relationship. There's a quote from President Nixon that was picked up on the White House tapes. He said, I like him, and I like the country, and some of those other bastards out there, I don't like.
Yeah, that sounds like.
And I think that sums it up. So let me get back. Throughout the 1960s, of course, the Iranian white revolution was in full swing. Dams were being built. Mass urbanization was underway. Literacy programs in full effect. Land redistribution. Dr. Cooper has set up for us the Cold War context in which all of this was happening. There were changing and conflicting attitudes about the role of women in society. Music, dancing, smoking, drinking, everything was commonplace like it would be in a Western country. And we'll focus in on this in a minute, but I want to hone in on some of what Dr. Cooper was talking about. We're going to set this up. Richard Nixon gets elected president in 1968. He's inaugurated in 1969, and shortly thereafter issues the Nixon Doctrine. Really, this was his grand strategy. This is important and significant in the U.S.-Iranian relationship. So I want to call up a quote from Dr. Roham Alvandi, who is the author of a great book, an academic study called Nixon, Kissinger, and the Shah. Dr. Alvandi writes in that book, quote, Nixon's presidency marked a turning point in the Shah's Cold War relationship with the United States. Under this administration, the Shah was able to shape the formation and implementation of the Nixon Doctrine in the Persian Gulf region. Although President Johnson and his advisors had seen regional stability as resting on a balance of power between Iran and Saudi Arabia as the twin pillars of the Gulf, between 1969 and 1972, the Shah convinced Nixon and Kissinger to abandon this policy and tilt in favor of Iran. In this process, Iran was transformed from a client to a partner of the United States in the global struggle to contain the Soviet Union. And I know that in several instances, as Dr. Alvandi has written and as Dr. Cooper just referenced, the Shah's previous requests for increased military assistance, Presidents Kennedy and Johnson were denied, and yet they were greenlit by President Nixon. Dr. Cooper, take us back. What was the Shah trying to achieve here in the Persian Gulf amid the Cold War?
Well, he was trying to essentially build his country up into the most important country in the region. And I think this is where perceptions on the American side were different from perceptions on the Iranian side. The Americans believed that after 1953, the Shah in some way owed them for his survival, but he never saw it that way. In fact, he wanted to build his country up. He had historic ambitions to reconstitute Iran. He felt very strongly and very aggrieved, I think, at the treatment of Iran by the Allies during World War II. And he wanted to become an indispensable ally, that this would in some ways make sure that there could never be another 1953 in Iran, that an outside government could not come in and change the government, even though he had been a beneficiary of that event in 53. So, in fact, when you're reading the diaries of his court minister, Mr. Alam, during the Nixon period, the Shah says, thanks to Nixon giving me what I need, what I want to build the Iranian military up, and over oil pricing, they can't touch me now. There will never be another 1953. And that was his mantra from that period on.
And let's relay that back to domestic politics, because, of course, domestic politics influences foreign policy. The Shah was focused on ushering in modernity, and this is amid the White Revolution, the Cold War, the women's movement. There are conflicts that are now being set up between old ways and new ways, and the Shah is trying to build a modern society. Some would argue with controversial methods, but he was trying to do it nonetheless. I want to call up a magazine cover because 50 years ago this month, Her Imperial Majesty the Shah Banu sat for an iconic cover story of an issue of Town and Country magazine as a symbol of the emerging role of women in Iranian society. A longtime journalist, award-winning journalist, and activist, Homa Sarshar, said that at that time, rights were being given to women and the future was bright. Dr. Cooper, comment on that.
Well, Iran actually under the Shah had a Minister of Women's Rights. It was moving very rapidly in terms of the Muslim world, but also in the Middle East, in terms of granting rights to women and the right to vote. The Shah reformed divorce laws, child custody laws. Women had reproductive choice rights, but he really strongly urged them to come into the workforce. They were allowed to work in government. The Shah Banu, of course, had been a sportswoman as a young person. She had played sports, and she was probably the most prominent advocate of women's rights in Iran. But so too was Princess Ashraf, the Shah's twin sister. And at one point in the 1970s, the Shah Banu said that she supported something called divorce insurance, so that if women were divorced, they would not be impoverished when they started their lives on their own again. So this sort of strong language we had from the palace in terms of women's rights it's almost like, in terms of Iran today, it's like digging through the ruins at Pompeii. I mean, you can't imagine how things were coming along in the late 1970s. And even on the eve of the revolution, as an example, the first women were entering corporate leadership positions in Iran. And that's one of the tragedies of the revolution, is that things were just coming on tap. Things were just starting to really come into their own when the revolution happened.
I want to call up a photo that was taken by a White House photographer on President Nixon's trip to Tehran, and we'll get that up in just a minute. It shows women wearing skirts. There isn't a chador in sight. They're waving American flags. This is all converging in May of 1972, when President Nixon, of course, makes that visit to Tehran, a crucial visit. And Colonel Brennan, you were there. You accompanied him. Talk to us about that trip.
They were very, very hospitable. But first, may I comment on the woman in Iran? And the second lady ever to be a White House social aide was a then Lieutenant Chris Alberts. She later came to San Clemente to be assistant to Mrs. Nixon, and left there to go to Iran to begin to help start the Iranian Women's Navy. And a lot of people don't even know there was an Iranian Women's Navy, but that was her job for several years. In any event, back to the trip itself, it was just it was different because they were so incredibly hospitable. Almost always we'd go to, if you go to Italy, for example, we stayed in a great hotel. But in Iran, in Tehran, I stayed, for example, in the home of the head of the Iranian military. And they were just wonderful, hospitable. And of course, the dinners and the festivities were beyond description. They did a remarkable job, and I wasn't involved in the policy part, but I was very impressed with the friendship, with the seemingly love of the people, and it was a great experience and a great tribute.
On May 30th, that President Nixon told the Shah, quote, "The Nixon Doctrine was a way for the U.S. to build a new long-term policy in support of allies." The concept of allies is something I'm going to come back to. I want to call up a couple of more photos of that visit. There you can see the motorcade. Nixon Library actually owns that limousine. See two men riding in. And of course, this had just come off the president's visit to the Soviet Union. Hal Saunders, who worked for Henry Kissinger, called the visit, quote, "the capstone event in the shift of U.S. Persian Gulf policy to sea." Of course, there were subsequent visits between the two men. The Shah visited President Nixon at the White House in 1973. So I say we're going to be doing this success of this series of events over the next years to occasions. By 1974, President Nixon was imperiled at home by Watergate. And after his resignation, the Shah had a different type of relationship with President Ford, who, of course, was still supportive, but didn't have that personal relationship. And then it was something else entirely through the Carter presidency. And there was a U.S. ambassador called William Sullivan, a career State Department official who was appointed ambassador to Iran, maybe at the worst time, maybe the worst person at the worst time. And Dr. Cooper, you have written a terrific book. I'm sure everyone in the room is familiar with your book on this subject. I mean, you've literally written 400 pages on this, but if you could take us through, very high level, the United States and Iran during the Iranian Revolution, 1978-79.
Yes, I mean, the tragedy of that moment, and that was 1978, where things really came unstuck. Jimmy Carter came to power in January 1977 with very strong ideas about the Shah and regimes like that. And there was a feeling that too much had been given to the Shah and that the relationship was out of balance. So there was a desire on his part to rebalance the relationship. And this caused anxiety in Tehran, of course. But I have to say that Iran was also important to Carter because of the Middle East peace process. The Shah had close relations with President Sadat of Egypt, and he also had a relationship with the Israelis. And so he could offer Iran as a sort of guarantor of security in the region. So, of course, Jimmy Carter goes to Tehran, and we have that famous scene on New Year's Eve, 1977, where he describes Iran as an island of stability, which, by the way, is a term that Kissinger coined in 1970, but we associate it with Jimmy Carter. And the administration really failed to understand what was happening in Iran at that time. The Shah had begun a liberalization program. He had started to reform the government. He was, of course, we now know that he was ill. He was secretly ill with lymphoma and receiving medical treatment. And Sullivan treated the Shah as though he was essentially as he was a dictator. And as you know from reading my book, The Fall of Heaven, that's not the Shah's personality at all. And the Shah was a much more complex person than that. There was a failure of attention to pay attention to what was happening in Iran all throughout 1978. And by the time the administration did start paying attention in September 1978, it was really too late. I was interested when I interviewed people around the Shah who had been in the regime at that time. They said that the turning point was the summer of 1978. That's when they lost control. But if you read the US documentation and you talk to US diplomats at that time and officials, White House officials, they only started to believe there was a crisis in September with the Jaleh Square shootings. And by then it was over. It was pretty much too late.
Shah is exiled. The royal family makes their way from country to country. They briefly settle, of course, in the United States and for a bit in Mexico. And another exiled world leader turns up at his doorstep in Cuernavaca, of all places. Colonel Brennan, tell us about this made-for-television story because you were there.
It was really pretty interesting. Via Ambassador Zahidi, I learned that Shah was in Cuernavaca. Told President Nixon, he said, we must find a way to visit him. And we did a lot of trying to figure it out. And I made the arrangements so that, and I notified the Shah via Ambassador Zahidi that we'd be coming to Cuernavaca to visit him. The report back was he was so excited, really wanted to see President Nixon. And I made the arrangements, and logistically it was, we would leave San Clemente, drive north to Los Angeles Airport, board a United Airlines DC-10 and fly to Mexico City, at which point Secret Service made arrangements for ground transportation in Cuernavaca. All pretty common, except the night before we were leaving, a DC-10 crashed in Chicago, and all DC-10s were grounded. But we couldn't disappoint the Shah, so I said, how am I going to figure this one out? So we left San Clemente in the limousine, and he's expecting us to turn north to go to Los Angeles. Instead, we turned south, and we started driving south for a while, and he looked at me, he said, what? And I said, well, sir, here's what happened. And I told him, I said, so the solution is we're going to drive to Tijuana, get on a Mexican DC-10, and fly to Mexico City. Well, it happened to be Friday the 13th, and he just paused for a long time, and he looked at me and said, are you sure? In any event, we did that. We went to Tijuana, we flew into Mexico City, we drove to Cuernavaca, and a lot of security, of course, and then a helicopter came over, and we're all kind of excited, but it turned out it was the Shah's son learning to fly helicopters. He later came and said hello, and it was very nice. But one thing was poignant to me. They sat it was very nicest location on the water, and they were both sitting alone. I mean, two of them with no staff, no nothing, and two chairs and the water behind them. And I was way in the background, and I looked at them and the two of them chatting, and I said to myself, and I still remember this, I said, how many thousands of people would still be alive if these two were still in power? And it was just, it was just a poignant moment for me.
Yeah, we actually have a clip of that moment. Just all up.
The news media was out in force for Nixon's arrival, and so were security people. More than 24 Secret Service and Mexican federal agents kept an eye out for trouble, but their only problem was an overly aggressive Tijuana newspaperman who was quickly herded back in line. Nixon arrived from San Clemente by motorcade and spent several minutes shaking hands with Tijuana dignitaries. One of those he met was the 10-year-old son of a Mexican industrialist who got the former president's autograph.
He said he'll come very soon here with his wife to their 40th anniversary here.
As he boarded the Aeromexico DC-10, Nixon stopped to wave at the crowd, then disappeared into the jet. Security agents searched the rest of the passengers, delaying the flight for half an hour. The only thing that turned up was an unclaimed bag containing clothes and papers. Mr. Nixon's trip may only be an elaborate goodwill gesture, but it's one the former president thinks other U.S. allies who are still in power will take to heart. Gene Cubison, News 8, Tijuana.
So Jack wasn't lying. And Jack, did you go with former President Nixon to the Shah's funeral in Cairo?
I did not. It was one of the great losses of my time. I happened to be playing in President Ford's golf tournament when the message came, and I couldn't get back in time. So I'm very disappointed to say I did not.
Well, you can see this image. The Carter administration did not send any American representatives, and former President Nixon was the only American representative at the Shah's funeral. And I think one key takeaway lesson that you can see reoccur, you see it in his campaign of 1968, you see it throughout his presidency, is this concept of allies. America maintaining her commitment to her allies. That really set up his grand strategy when he took over and became president in 1969. He could have cut and run in South Vietnam or in Vietnam. He didn't. And he said that if America abandons her allies, she will lose credibility. So we actually have a clip of President Nixon landing in Cairo at the Shah's funeral on the subject of allies.
What has happened since the Shah left, of course, speaks more eloquently than any memoirs could really present. There's no question that the Shah leaving Iran is a tragedy, a personal tragedy for him, a tragedy for the people of Iran who now are suffering repression much greater than they had before, who have 4 million at least unemployed and runaway inflation, and under a government that is not really a government, it's really a mob. All these things have happened, but also it was, in addition to being a personal tragedy for the Shah, a tragedy for the people of Iran, it was certainly a tragedy for what we call the West, because what was leadership and stability in that part of the world is now replaced by instability.
There is no doubt that life in Iran under the Shah was far different than life today. And here's what President Nixon had to say on that in speaking with Dr. Frank Gannon in 1983.
Can you say that if you had stayed in office that you would not have allowed the Shah to fall?
I would not have, no. I would have been steadfast throughout. I would have made it very clear down through the bureaucracy that there was to be absolutely no contact with those that were trying to overthrow him. I would have had a very good study made of Khomeini's background and would have found that exactly what kind of person he was, because by studying his background, they could have known that he was going to do exactly what he's going to do. The man is a radical reactionary. He's not a progressive in any sense of the word.
If you had been...
See, the choice basically was not between the Shah and somebody better. The choice was between him and somebody worse. And it's very easy for me to make that choice.
If you had been confronted with the worst case from that point of view, and the Shah had been overthrown and hostages taken, and you were president, would you have taken him into the United States?
Absolutely. I would have taken him into the United States, and as far as the hostages are concerned, I would have handled that a little differently too. I don't say this in criticism of President Carter, because he certainly went through a lot on the hostage situation. He believes it may have cost him the election. I don't think it did. I think the economic issues were the major ones. But be that as it may, it didn't help him. But as far as the hostage situation was concerned, American foreign policy can never be made hostage to hostages. That's why hostages are taken, for purposes of blackmail. And we mustn't let that happen. And for example, when President Carter was asked about the hostage situation, he went overboard in saying that our first and then only concern was the safety of the hostages. Now, that is a concern, but our major concern is what happens to Iran, what happens to the relations between the United States and Iran. And in this respect, I would never have said, as President Carter did, that I rule out the use of force in order to get the hostages back. All that did was to encourage those that had captured them when we were holding them in captivity, not to give them up.
Yeah, I think, Jack, Colonel Brennan, I think as you said, imagine what life would be like if those two men had stayed in power. We're going to wrap this up, and I want to ask Dr. Cooper, did the Shah achieve his objectives for Iran in the Cold War, even for a time?
Yes. I would argue that he did. He provided not only Iran, but the whole region with a cloak of security and stability for throughout the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. And then, of course, the irony is that the Islamic Republic used the Shah's army to fight and defend themselves against Iraq in the 1980s. But certainly during the Cold War, the Shah's policies did provide his country and his people with peace and prosperity for a while, and that in maybe that was all they could hope for during the Cold War, because in some ways the Shah is a victim of the Cold War. The pressures on the Shah and on the Pahlavi regime and Iran from both sides were so intense that it's really a wonder that I think it's a wonder that he survived for as long as he did, for 37 years. I think was a huge accomplishment.
Any final thoughts? Is that a no?
I was proud to know him and his people, and it was a very, very impressive, exciting time for me.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, would you join me in thanking our panel this evening? And as I mentioned at the outset, we really want this to be the beginning of a renewed relationship with the Persian community, the Iranian-American community. So we envision this as really the first of a series of these types of discussions over the next several years. So I invite you to sign up, get our emails at nixonfoundation.org. Also, our friends at Ivol have generously provided a bottle of wine for every couple tonight, which you can pick up on your way out. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you again soon. Good night. Thank you. Thank you. How'd I do?
Well, very well.
Are you there, Jim?
Jack Prince.